Good evening. They've asked me to wear this in the hopes that prosperity might prove to be aided by my words of wisdom this evening. Actually, all you older fellows, and young women and older women, can go to sleep. This won't be too important to you, but you younger folks might want to take notes. You might learn something, but I doubt it. Well, my name is Samuel Langhorne Clemens. That's all the introduction you're going to get. I figure you came in here knowing pretty much what we're getting into, so. Actually, I don't like introductions. Always too many compliments. I remember once I was introduced to an audience by a lawyer that kept his hands in his pockets. He introduced me as Mark Twain, a humorist who's really funny. Very rare creature indeed. I was struck speechless by this complimentary thunderbolt. Seldom in my life had I heard a compliment so beautifully phrased or so well deserved. However, I was quick to point out that we had an even rarer creature in our midst than a humorist who was really funny. We had a lawyer that kept his hands in his own pockets. But you know, I've only had one introduction in public that I thought was just the thing. Had grace to it. Kind of inspiring, too. By a person who didn't even know me. You know, he came up and he asked me, now you don't want any compliments. Of course I said I didn't want any compliments at all. So he got up there and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I shan't waste any time with introductions because I don't know anything about this man at all. I should say I only know two things. One, he's never been in the penitentiary. And two, I don't know why." I'm glad you could all make it tonight. You'll notice I was late, which is natural. You see, I came here by train. I was on one of those trains that gets tired every 15 minutes and has to stop and rest for 3/4 of an hour. The passenger on board told the engineer to take the cow catcher off the front and put her on the rear. Because at the rate we were going, we were not going to catch any cows. There was nothing to keep them from climbing aboard on the rear. Well, let's see. Are there any cards? Any cards left at all? The people came in. No cards. Well, I'll try to answer these questions the best I can with a minimum amount of lying. But I shouldn't say that, I guess. I don't lie, you see. I differ from George Washington. George could not tell a lie. I can, but I won't. I'm also from Missouri. Is anyone here from Missouri? Oh. That's what I thought. I'm reminded of a little story I heard once about a girl who lived in Iowa. His family was moving to Missouri. She walked out on the back steps of the porch to look at her backyard for the last time. She said, "Goodbye, blue sky, I'm going to Missouri. Goodbye, green grass, I'm going to Missouri. Goodbye, God, I'm going to Missouri." You know, that's not true. She didn't say that. She didn't say, "Goodbye, God, I'm going to Missouri." She said, "Good, by God, I'm going to Missouri." I'd best get on with this interview, I guess. Well, of course, I can't really call it an interview. Interviews always have a bad connotation as far as I'm concerned. I picked up this aversion to interviews when I was just becoming an itinerant lecturer in the West. I used to have all these local interviews come knock on my door and bother me all the time. I remember one time when I was in San Francisco, a man came in and introduced himself as being a representative of the Daily Thunderstorm. My first inclination was to break a chair over his head, but he sat in it before I could go into action. Well, obviously my powers were a bit under a cloud that day, so I thought the best thing I could do was confuse him. I believe he started out and he said, Mr. Twain, I'd like to ask you certain questions calculated to bring out the hidden points of your public and private life. What do you do it with? Well, usually it consists of the interviewer asking questions and the interviewee answering them. But I have a very poor memory. Well, that's all right, just so you do your best. Oh, I will. I'll put my whole mind to it. That's good. Mr. Twain, how old are you? 19. In June? Oh, really? I'd have taken you to be much older than that. Well, thank you very much. Well, when did you begin to write? 1836. Well, how could you begin writing in 1836 if you're only 19 now? That seems rather curious to you, doesn't it? Well, yes, it does. Well, let me ask you something else. Who would you say was the most remarkable man you've ever met? Oh, I'd have to say Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr? Well, if you're only 19, how could you possibly met Aaron Burr? Now, if you know more about my life than I do, what do you ask me for? Well, I'm sorry. How did you happen to meet Mr. Burr? Well, you see, I was at his funeral one day, and they asked me to make less noise. Make less noise? Well, if you were at his funeral, he must have been dead, and why should he care if he made noise or not? Oh, he's always kind of particular that way. Well, I see. You say he was dead, and yet he spoke to you. Oh, I didn't say he was dead. Oh, wasn't he? Well, some said he was, yes. Some said he wasn't. What did you think? Wasn't any of my business. Wasn't my funeral. Well, I see. Well, did he? Let me ask you something else. Now, do you have any brothers or sisters? Brothers or sisters? I know, I think I do, but I can't rightly remember. Oh, that's the most amazing. Well, didn't I read somewhere where you had a brother? Brother. Oh, yeah. Yes. Did have a brother. William. Bill, we used to call him. Poor old Bill. Is he dead? Oh, we never could tell. Well, I see, then he disappeared. Well, yes, in the general sort of way. We buried him. You buried him without knowing whether he was dead or not? Oh, no. He was dead enough, all right. He was always kind of dead. But I'll tell you something, the most amazing thing, there's a mystery about that. See, We were twins, defunct and I. And one of us was drowned in a bathtub when we were 18 months old. Some think it was Bill. Some think it was me. What did you think? Well, I'd give worlds to know. This terrible, this awful mystery has been bothering me since I was that high, but I'll tell you something. Never told anybody else. One of us had a curious mark on the back of his left shoulder. That was the child that drowned. That child was me. Well, of course, he ran out and I never saw him again. However, the next day in the newspaper, I did read the headline. Deranged old man loose in local hotel. Harmless, if not riled up. Well, I did say I'd get to the questions, didn't I? I understand you wear a white suit. Why? Well, I've often been asked that question. You see, it's because I've traveled a great deal, and I've mixed with savages, royalty, middle folks, and just plain ordinary folks. One thing I've always noticed is that clothes make the man. Naked people have little or no effect on society. Dear Mr. Twain, I do understand that you smoke. Now tell me, yes or no, is it true? Do you smoke? I don't mind if I do. I hope you don't mind if I smoke. Can't really see any harm in it as long as there are no children present. I began smoking myself until I was 9. Even then I wasn't constant. I was always willing to give it up if I could see any profit in it. Not that I cared for moderation myself. I do it as an example to others and to prove that I'm not a slave to the habit. I can give it up whenever I want to. I've done it 1,000 times. I remember the first time I gave it up. I was about 9 or 10. They told me I'd cut 10 years off my life by smoking. So I got scared one day and gave it up for 2 or 3 hours. Then I decided that the decade wouldn't be worth living without smoking in it, so that was the end of that. Another time was on the advice of my doctor. See, I'd been confined to my bed for several days with a lumbago. I didn't seem to be getting any better, and finally said to me, well, look here, no wonder my medicines aren't doing any good. You smoke extravagantly. You eat all manner of things that don't agree with each other's company. And you drink 2 hot scotches every night, don't you? I said, why, yes, I do. But I only drink them as a preventative of toothache. I've never had the toothache. And I never intend to have it either. Well, he said that was all right, but I have to moderate those things. And I said, Doctor, I can't do it. And he said, why not? Because I lack the willpower. I can cut them off completely, but I can't moderate them. And he said that would answer. And so I gave up those delicacies for 2 or 3 days. And at the end of that time, the lumbago was discouraged and left me. Well, it seemed a pretty good plan, so... seemed a pretty good plan. So I had an opportunity to advise this to an elderly lady friend of mine. She'd gone down and down to the point where medicines no longer had any helpful effect on her. So I told her what she must do is give up smoking and drinking and eating and swearing. And at the end of a week, she'd be on her feet. Well, she said she couldn't do that because she never smoked nor drank nor swore. So there it was. She neglected her habits. Well, just one or two little bad habits would have saved her. Instead, she was just a moral pauper. She was like a sinking ship with no freight to throw overboard. Let's see, what else do we have here? The square root of pi. Maybe I just go back to my lecture. It's a temperance lecture. It's really good, too. Well, on second thought, never mind. Let's see. Mr. Twain, you look like you've traveled a great deal from pictures I've seen of you. That's true. Tell me, where have you traveled? Well, I've traveled all over the world. And I imagine you've heard about some of my travels. But one you probably haven't heard of was when I went west on the overland stage to the Silverlands in Nevada. That was when I was young and studying for the gallows. Well, we finally got to Nevada, which is on the edge of the Great Western Desert. Now, Nevada looks something like a singed cat. And rumor has it that the Almighty created Nevada, but when you come to see it, you'll think differently. About the 27th day out, we came to the Carson River, which is a moist ditch. Which is similar to the Erie in all respects, except that the Erie is 6 times wider and 4 times deeper. If it was my river, I wouldn't leave it out at night like that. In such a careless way, any dog might come up and lap it up. Well, we finally got to Virginia City, which was a good place for a man to lose his religion, if he had any by the time he got there. There were wide open gambling houses, street fights, riots, brass bands, fire companies, murders, killings, and some talk of building a church. There's no place for a Presbyterian. And I did not remain one very long. When I was in Virginia City, I thought I'd buy a horse because everyone else seemed to be riding one. So I went to an auction and bought a genuine Mexican plug on the advice of a man I later found out was the auctioneer's brother-in-law. Well, I got on the horse and he put all his feet together in a bunch and shot me about 6, 7 feet in the air. I came down on the back of the saddle. He shot me up in the air again and I came down on the high pommel. That was too much variety for me. So I decided to get off. But before I could, I was up in the air again. While I was up there, somebody sings out, "Ma, don't eat buckthorn." Well, I was in no position to argue that point. And somebody hit the horse with a strap, and when I came down, the genuine Mexican plug was not there. And I dug myself out of the ground and promised myself that if the auctioneer's brother's funeral took place while I was in Virginia City, I'd postpone all other amusements and attend it. Every now and then I'd amuse myself by writing articles for the Territorial Journal. And every now and then they'd send me down to the Capitol to cover the insurrections of our legislature. We already had a political editor who was pretty good. Only needed a term or two in the penitentiary to be perfect. I think I can brag, and with some good sense, that we had a legislature that brought the highest prices of any other legislature in the world. I remember one of those legislators got a $20,000 agricultural fair to show off $40 worth of pumpkins grown on his brother's farm. He showed promise in a political sort of way. Would have gotten a reputation and gone to Washington if he had lived. But he was shot by some friends over a minor difference of opinion. I bore him no malice. I'd send him a fan if I could. I didn't attend the funeral, but I sent a very nice note saying that I approved of it. Let's see. I understand that you were married at one time. How did you happen to meet your wife? We've got a romantic in the crowd. Well, I'll tell you about that. It's quite a story. You see, I was in the Holy Land on the Quaker City, which was a ship. And I met a man by the name of Charlie Langdon. Well, he showed me an ivory miniature of his sister, Olivia. From that moment on, I was in love. When I finally got back to New York, we were only married a year later. Now, it sounds very unencumbered and unobtrusive, but it wasn't like that at all. It's a great deal of courtship. There were 4 or 5 proposals and just as many refusals. Well, you see, I was out on the lecture beat at that time. But I'd get back every now and then to Elmira to renew the siege. I remember one time I dug an invitation out of Charlie to stay 2 weeks. Well, it helped a great deal, but it had to come to an end. But at the last moment, it was one of those things that happened that had the hand of Providence in it. It was one of those things that happened so often a long time ago, but very seldom happen anymore. Well, Charlie and I were about to leave for New York City. But luckily for me, the coach hadn't been hooked up to the horses just right. So when Barney the coachman struck the horse with the whip, back end of the carriage went like that, and I landed right on top of my head. And I stood up that way for a while and finally crashed to the street. Well, everybody was worried about me. I was unconscious. He was very good unconscious for a person who hadn't studied the part. Well, Charlie was considerably battered. I wasn't doing too bad, but he was too worried about me to worry too much, so his family crowded around me and poured out of the house. And then they stuck enough brandy between my lips to make me stand up and bark. And then they poured some liquid fire on my head, which was supposed to reduce contusions, but I knew mine would scoff at it. It would not reduce my unconsciousness one iota, because I was taking care of that myself. Livy's sister parted on my head for a while, and she got tired and Livy took over. Well, that was very nice. In fact, if Livy's manipulations had continued, I'd probably be unconscious to this day. That helped a great deal, too. We were engaged conditionally, but her father wanted references. Of course, I was an almost entirely unknown person from the other side of the continent, so I had to write some distance. So I sent for references, and we waited. Finally, they came, and I was sent for. He looked at them, and he was quiet for some time, like he couldn't think of anything. Well, apparently, these references had been franked to a fault. Not only did they speak of disapproval of me, but they were enthusiastic about it. One of the clergymen said I'd fill a drunkard's grave. It was one of those long-term prophecies. There's no being no time limit on it. So far. Well, never mind. As I said, he didn't seem to know what to say. And I was in pretty much the same condition. So finally he looked up and he said, "Well, now, who are these people? Well, it's apparent you don't have a friend in the world." "I guess so, Mr. Langdon." "Well, I know you better than they do. Take the girl." So I had a gold band picked out. Had the engagement date imprinted on it. February 2nd, 1869. It was not removed from her hand again, except when I took it from her hand to do service as a wedding ring, and had the date engraved February 4th, 1870. It was never removed from her hand again. In Italy, when death had restored her vanished beauty, that she looked girlish as she had when she was a young lady and a bride. They wanted to take that ring from her finger and save it for the children. But I prevented that sacrilege. It remains buried with her. Let's see what else we have. Here's a good one. Dear Mr. Twain, what do you think of the war? What do I think of the war? The way I figured, all wars are pretty much the same. Maybe you can learn something from an experience I had. In fact, I got a couple stories for you about war. It was in 1861, that summer. You see, I was visiting in my hometown of Hannibal. And just a month prior to that, Union soldiers had invaded the state of Missouri. Well, Caleb Jackson, the governor, called for 50,000 volunteers to repel the enemy. Well, when I was in town, several of us got together and we formed a little company of men. We were all from Marion County, and we called ourselves the Marion Rangers. No one saw any better name to come up with. We had a captain by the name of Tom Lyman, and the rest of us were second lieutenants. We didn't have any first lieutenants. I don't remember why. It was a long time ago. Well, anyway, about the first hour or two, it was just a lot of fun. We were prancing along, laughing and joking with each other. You see, we didn't really go into the particulars of war. One seldom does at 24. Well, after about 3 hours, all this trudging along got to seem like work. And all the fun started to drain out of it. Oh, but it was all right for a while. New scenery, change of occupation, new things to do. I remember we came upon a farmhouse where, according to reports, 5 Union soldiers were staying. Tom Lyman said, well, we ought to go down there. Well, here we were, face to face with war, our first encounter. But we were equal to the situation. We told Lyman if he wanted to go down there and mix it up with those soldiers, he could. But if he was going to wait for us, he was going to wait a long time. So we had a brilliant flanking maneuver about 2 miles to the north. Well, we came across several encounters like that, and always we had a strategic retreat or a brilliant flanking movement. It went on that way for some time. Some time, that is, until one night in August. We were staying in a corn crib, which was serving as our night post. It was dark and dreary, and all of us were tired. We'd heard that there were reports of Union soldiers in the area, cavalry. Well, we never paid too much attention to this. So we figured they were all over the place, and we were always being chased somewhere. But suddenly, all of us in one movement, without a word, moved to the front of the corn bin and peeked out through the logs. And presently we heard the sound of a horseman, several horsemen, on the path. And sure enough,
after a while, we went out there to see what became of the man.
he was lying in the center of the path, his arms spread out, heaving huge gasps. Blood splattered all over his chest. Instinctively, I just moved to my knees and started rubbing his forehead uselessly. Everyone else stood around, almost to the point of tears, wishing, to the point that they could change places with him if he'd only be all right. But he died, right there in the path. There's only one horseman. He had no uniform, and he wasn't armed. But he was killed in a legal war. Killed in battle, you might say, by legal soldiers who had a moral right to do what they did. Or so they say. He was a stranger in that country. That's all we ever found out about him. Well, I decided to relinquish this sham soldiership while I still had some remnant of my self-respect left. Well, I could have gone on to be a soldier. No, I didn't want to. It seemed to me to be the epitome of war. Strangers killing other strangers. Or in any other circumstance, they would help you if you needed it, or you could help them whenever they were in need. Others of us went on to the war, got some reputation. No, but I left. It seemed to have some effect on the Confederacy, I guess, because just 3 years later it fell. I've got 2 stories for you. That's what I said, wasn't it? Someplace. It is. Everybody around my house thinks that this is sacrilege, that I'm getting sacrilegious in my old age. That isn't true. See, I've always been sacrilegious. I'm just beginning to show it more. Let's see if I've got this in order. Well, anyway, a friend of mine came up to the house the other day, Dan Beard. And he read it and he said it was sacrilegious too. They also said, "Are you going to publish it?" I just looked at him and I said, "Now in this world, Dan, only the dead can speak the truth. This will be published after I'm dead." It's called the War Prayer. It goes something like this. It was a time of great and exalting excitement. The country was up in arms, the war was on, in every breast burned the holy fire of patriotism. The drums were beating, the bands playing, the toy pistols were popping. And in every hand and on every roof was fluttering a wilderness of flags that flashed in the sun. Daily the young volunteers marched down the wide avenue, gay and fine in their new uniforms. Nightly, packed mass meetings listened, panting with patriotic oratory which stirred them to the deepest depths. And tears were running down their faces all the while. And the churches was preached devotion to flag and country, and invoked the God of battles, beseeching his aid in our good cause and outpouring fervid eloquence, which moved every listener. And so finally Sunday morning came. Next day the battalions would leave for the front. The church was filled, the volunteers were there, their young faces alight with martial dreams. And with the volunteers sat their dear ones, proud and happy, and envied by their neighbors and friends who had no sons to send forth onto the field of honor, there to win for flag and country, or failing, die the noblest of deaths. The service proceeded. A war chapter was read from the Old Testament. The first prayer was said, and then came the long prayer. Well, none could remember for the like of it, for passionate pleading, and beautiful and moving language. The burden of its supplication was that the Father of us all would watch over our noble young soldiers and help them to crush the foe, grant to them and to their flag and country imperishable honor and glory. An aged stranger entered and moved with a slow and noiseless step up the main aisle. His long body clothed in a robe that reached to his feet. His head was bare. His white hair was descending in a frothy cataract down around his shoulders. All eyes following him and wondering, he made his silent way without pausing and ascended to the preacher's side and stood there waiting. Oh, the shut lids of the preacher, unconscious of his presence, continued his moving prayer, and at last finished with the moving words, "Bless our arms, grant us the victory, O Lord our God, Father and Protector of our land and flag." Well, the stranger touched his arm and motioned him to step aside, which startled the minister, but he did. And then the old man took his place. And in a deep voice he said, "I come from the throne, bearing a message from Almighty God. He has heard the prayer of his servant, your shepherd, and will grant it if such shall be your desire, after I, his messenger, have explained its import. That is to say, its full import. Is your prayer one prayer? No, it is two. One uttered, the other not. Both have reached the ear of him who heareth all supplications, the spoken and unspoken. Now ponder this and keep it in mind. You've heard your servant's prayer, the uttered part of it. Now I'm commissioned of God to put in the words the other part of it. Well, upon the listening spirit of God the Father fell both parts of it. He commandeth me to put it into words. Listen. O Lord our Father, our young patriots, idols of our hearts, go forth into battle. Be thou near them. With them in spirit we also go forth from the sweet peace of our beloved firesides to smite the foe. O Lord our God, help us to tear their soldiers to bloody shreds with our shells. Help us to cover their smiling fields with pale forms of their patriot dead. Help us to drown the thunder of their guns with the shrieks of their wounded writhing in pain. Help us to lay waste to their humble homes. Help us to wring the hearts of their unoffending widows with unavailing grief. Help us to turn them out ruthless, with their little children to wander unfriended the wastes of their desolated land, in rags and hunger, broken in spirit, worn with travail, imploring thee for the refuge of the grave, and denied it. For our sakes who adore thee, Lord. Blast their hopes, blight their lives, make heavy their steps, and water their way with their tears. We ask it in the spirit of love, of him who is the source of love, and who is ever faithful refuge and friend of all that are sore beset and seek his aid with humble and contrite heart. Amen. And after a pause, ye have prayed it. If ye still desire it, speak. The messenger of the Most High awaits. It was believed afterward that the man was a lunatic because there was no sense in what he said. Well, I'm going to call a little rest break now for two reasons. One, I want to see if that'll sink in or not. Second of all, it's a terrible death to be talked to death. So I like to pause every now and then. Give some of you a chance to escape if you desire it. And this is your chance. I'll see you survivors back here in about 10 minutes. I stood up